So I'm going to walk you through about 12 years of my life, research that I've put into understanding my great-granduncle Bram Stoker's life. It's been quite interesting. And through all this, I've traveled the world to archives, libraries, Romania, tops of mountains in Romania, which we'll get to, and had a really wonderful time I want to share with you folks. But a little reflection just before I start, and that is, I sort of wondered why I'm here. I'm a horror guy. And then I realized that the theme here is politics and news. So I think I fit right in. And further to that, fake news is something that obviously we're all very concerned about. And in a way, fictional writers, we capitalize on that in a certain way. And Carl Hysaiasson, if anybody listened to some of his talks about the pit bull on the arm, I mean, that was wonderful. But Bram Stoker did the same thing. I did the same thing. Many writers do the same thing. What we do is we latch on something that is real, memorable, maybe obscure, maybe horrifying, as a horror guy we do, and then you try to trick your readers into believing that that's possibly real, and then you've got them. There's a technical term called the willful suspension of disbelief. Sounds very academic, but that's what we try to get y'all to do, is read the story and you latch on to real places, real things, real happenings, and then the writer kind of takes you down this trail and you're going to get tricked into it. And of course, that's the same thing that some of these news outlets are doing to everybody in Facebook and so on. Bram Stoker did this with vampirism. He realized, and I'm going to show you shortly, some of his notes, some of his research, that many people around the world believe this to be real. And he capitalized on it. He found in libraries accounts of vampirism. I found accounts of vampirism. I found the ones that he found because of the internet, which is neat, and because of certain libraries that have given me access to open up. So you see the opening slide. You see Dracula. Book came out in 1897. It's an incredible story. Anybody read it here in the audience? I figured I'd get a target-rich environment here. Anybody read the one below that? That's my prequel. That's actually the hardcover picture of the hardcover. They're selling the paperback, which just came out. So if we can get into that a little later, I'm going to tell you how that story sort of came around. But let's advance this thing and let's get on with this. Just a little more background on myself. The first book I wrote actually was this one in 2009, which was a sequel to Dracula. I was a school teacher, an athletics coach. I taught middle school all the way up to coaching the Olympic Games for Canada. But there was a point where I just needed to delve into my family's background. And that's when it got really interesting. Because you'll see the book Dracula the Undead. When I was researching that, Bram has 2 great-grandsons still alive. And they were raised by Bram's son. And they had boxes of stuff in their attic that they didn't really know the significance of it. They were, if there's a chartered accountant here in the audience, don't hold it against me. They were retired chartered accountants. Not very creative, not interested in horror. And in reality, Dracula didn't become really well known in the scholarly world until 1962, when Oxford University deemed it a classic. And then the academics were looking into this, analyzing the heck out of it, writing master's thesis, doctoral thesis, all the rest of the stuff. But I was lucky. I got to the great-grandsons first and found the lost journal. And that's this other picture you here see with Bram's young face. I found a journal of Bram's, something he wrote while he was a young man in Dublin, Ireland, growing up, trying to become a writer while he was still working as a civil servant and a big-time athlete. That gave me insight into Bram's brain. And I sort of thought, I'm a bit of and you hear the term literary forensic detective. I like to profile Bram, as I did my students and my athletes, to get the best out of them. But to get into Bram's mind, what made him write this story that changed the world, and how can I use that to enlighten folks and write a prequel myself? And so you see down below, you see the Putnam books. Those are 2 covers, the soft cover and hardcover. And then recently, I've actually released through a small publishing company in England, Tell Us, a companion book to these talks called Stoker on Stoker. And then the red-looking one with the horrible-looking face, somebody said, "Is that you, Dacre?" It's not really. Some artist did. Artists don't have a lot of say in our book covers. But this is an interesting one. This is Dracula, as you can all have read. But I've actually, because of my research, inserted the things that Bram edited out of it, which is a mysterious first chapter that never made it in, but his widow published it 2 years after he died. She needed some income, published some of his short stories. Dracula's Guest was one of them, so I attached that in the book. And then you're going to see the ending that Bram Stoker originally planned to have in his novel, which is very different than the ending we've all known today. All right, movies. How many have seen a vampire movie or a Dracula movie? Okay, I figured that's going to happen in this area. So I get invited to some pretty cool gigs. Audrey Hepburn's son, Sean Farrar, invited me to Granada, Spain, for a film festival to receive an award on behalf of the Stoker estate. And they showed old vampire movies and old Monty Python movies. So I had my mind full of, he's always looking at the bright side, and then Bela Lugosi. So this is a montage to kind of get us in the mood for how films have adapted Uncle Bram's work. So what I'm sharing with you here is some interesting cover art. As I said, most likely, any authors here in the crowd ever had control over one of your book covers? Most likely not. But it's cool to think when you look over the ages, starting from 1897 to present day, somebody in the graphic art department decides what's going to scream out to you, this is a horrific, horrifying vampire novel. And the one that just had the flames, the yellow one way over on the far side, that's the original. And I don't have time to tell you the background of all of them. But look at that yellow color with this red, obviously blood red. The yellow was actually supposed, in those days, it's supposed to look at, sort of horrifying things. It was a symbol sort of for degeneration. And it was also a symbol for decomposition of the body. So if you've ever had a bruise, and as you get hit with something and not too long later, it's sort of this reddish color, and then as the blood decomposes, it's sort of the blue and then green and it ends up yellow. And that's why this book cover was chosen for that particular thing. The novel has been translated over 1,000 editions around the world. It's now in public domain, never been out of print, which means they don't have to pay my family any money if they want to do it, but that's okay. Over 700 movie citations with a Dracula in it, not just a vampire. All over the world, not just the English world, since 1922 with Nosferatu, and over 1,000 comic book adaptations and stage. So this thing obviously permeates into our entertainment. And now let's get into actually how Uncle Bram wrote the book. I get asked, Dacre, sum it up. The news guys want a bite. I can't sum it up. I'm doing the best you guys right here by using the term the perfect storm. Part of Bram's own life was horrifying. He was born in Black 47, which is a time in Ireland, and he was just outside of Dublin. They had potato famines, cholera epidemics. People were dying in the streets, moving from the countryside to come and try to get any kind of food at soup kitchens. And poor Bram, the third of 7 kids, wasn't expected to live, would have been seeing this from the 3rd floor of his house. He was isolated so he could stay healthy from whatever was causing. They didn't know what caused this poor kid to be sick for the first 7 years of his life. But he saw all this going on. So just imagine, if you would, a young child, 7 years, this sort of trauma. And then I found out that he was most likely bloodlet because he had an uncle who was a famous fever doctor. And I found a treatise on the internet describing what they would do with people with the same symptoms Bram had. And that was leeching or cutting. And they would leech or cut not just a little bit. It was not very scientific. Really, they'd take enough blood out of the child until he passed out, fainted. Imagine that. And then, for recovery, just like if we give blood anywhere, we give you apple juice or orange juice to get your sugar levels up, they'd give you claret, red wine, and oil to cleanse. So now this poor little kid, traumatized by being leeched and cut, passed out, come to, young man, drink this, and now he's drunk for the rest of the day or so. Over 7 years. So my mind as a writer, I got to capitalize on this. This is something too cool. I flash forward ahead to Jonathan Harker in the castle where the women in white are coming and taking his blood to stop him from having enough power to mount his escape out of the castle. I think somewhere in this little Bram Stoker's brain that sat back here somewhere. Furthermore, he went to Trinity College in Dublin. He recovered miraculously to be a champion athlete, became a big man on campus, became the head of the Philosophical Society, the Historical Society. He was BMOC. But deep down inside him, he wanted to be a writer. He was practicing poetry, and I know this from finding his journal. He was a romantic. He had 3 brothers, doctors, very famous doctors. My great-granduncle being one of them, who invented ozone therapy. Another one was knighted for doing, well, surgeries before they had names for them, but he's featured in the book because Thornley was very close to Bram and actually helped Bram write Dracula. He was the medical consultant to the novel, and we've seen this in the manuscript, all the little things about bloodletting and all this other stuff. Bram's father actually retired. He was an older guy when he married, 7 kids. He retired about halfway through all the children, and Bram had to go to work. As a student, he was the only one that became a civil servant while he was the BMOC, and he had to work at the same place where his dad retired from, Dublin Castle, the center of English government. So Bram became a clerk in the Petty Sessions Legal Department. And I think this was the beginning of what caused a lot of conflict within young Bram. This was his analytical side of his brain was in heaven, figuring out all the things that people had to do for minor criminal activity, not exciting, gory stuff. But if you ran over someone's chicken, or you didn't pay your taxes, or if the dogs had needing tags and license and so on. So Bram was stuck in this castle doing very mundane stuff, an awful lot like Jonathan Harker. But in the meantime, he escaped in his free time to write theatrical reviews for the theaters in town and had them published in the same newspaper that Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who was another Irish writer who wrote Carmilla. So these guys had a connection. Bram at least had his way to do something creative. Well, his father said, no, you got to stick at this. This is good for you. His other brothers are scientists and his 2 sisters being trained in the arts, and Bram was this sadly conflicted young man. His mom, though, to keep him occupied, and the nanny, and keep him sort of interested while he was going through this 7-year illness, told him a number of stories, Irish folklore. And it's not little leprechauns and gold at the end of the rainbow. This is, if you look in Irish folklore, it's horrifying stuff. And I'm sure that framed Bram's macabre sense of imagination. And one of them is a story, and I kid you not, you'll see it in just a moment, of her witnessing premature burial because of misdiagnosis when she saw the cholera epidemic ravage through her town in Sligo. This is a treatise I found. These are images. That's not Bram and Abraham Lincoln, although it looks like it might be. But this is the treatise on the bloodletting. And you can see some of these early diagrams of, they at least knew where to cut folks. It wasn't the vampire in the neck very often. It was mostly in the arms and the arteries down by in the groin area. But you can see not very pleasant. But this is a treatise written by William Stoker. His son, Edward Alexander Stoker, was alive when Bram was going through this, and he did the same thing. And he becomes a character in our story. So I keep popping back to this, let's base things in reality and see if we can drag you guys along and trick you a little bit. Here's this cholera story that Bram's mother lived through, 1832, absolutely true. And that story that you see typed down below is something that Bram asked his mom to send him when he was a young man starting to write stories. So she told him this story orally when he was just somewhere between 0 and 7. It made such an impression upon him. He said, Mom, would you send me the story? So that's it, typed up. It's in Trinity College Archives, so I know exactly what it is. He used this story, this is also a little macabre, in a book of children's stories, horrifying children's stories. So we know it made an impact on him. So what J.D. Barker and I did in our book was we took elements of that story because we know for sure that impacted him. There were other people who were misdiagnosed and buried prematurely. And let me just, I'm going to tell that story. Just forget this picture for a moment because I've got to go back to this. You don't need to see the writing, but here's the gist of it. Imagine the mother, she's 13 years old, and she's in this town. And here's a contagious disease that's swiping across Europe. Sorry, this is a little bit too realistic to what we're dealing with the coronavirus. And I live near Atlanta, and when Ebola came in because of the health workers being sent back from Africa, and Emory was able to help them, people reacted the same way. We didn't know how to stop this. In this day, with all our sophistication, they didn't know how to stop Ebola, and now they're getting a handle on coronavirus. In those days, they had no idea what was causing this cholera. And what was happening is the folks, the first line of defense were the medical folks, and they would be touching people who were obviously sweating from their fevers, and it was the water droplets. Obviously, you could get it either from the sewage that was tainting the water or from their own fluid, and they would be dying. So in Sligo, there was no more medical people alive. The next round of people to help and who were handling bodies were the religious folks. The different denominations of religions were coming together to help handle the bodies, cleanse them, and give them a good burial. They were dying off. So the two most educated group of folks in the area no longer around to help. So the next group of people were simply street people, public workers who were being paid money to help get the bodies out of the houses, off the streets, and into the hospitals. Where what they would do was they would, that sounds like a Monty Python, not dead or maybe dead, take a pulse. They didn't know if it's dead or not. Pull them off the gurney and put somebody who was not so dead on the gurney, give them some laudanum to make them, ease the pain, and they would hopefully die peacefully. That's all they could do. And then bury them in mass graves. There was no more individual mass graves, lime, dirt bodies. Well, the story that Bram got, as I summarize this for you, a neighbor, the husband had his wife who was feeling ill, and he goes, she's got the cholera. So he takes a red scarf around her stomach to ease the pain, puts her on his back, and brings her to the hospital. Same thing happens. They throw on a gurney. He goes off to work. At the end of the day, he comes home to see how his wife is feeling. She's gone. Where'd you bring her? At the end of the street in the hole. So he goes to look for the wife, and he sees all these bodies, and he sees one with the red scarf. He can go and give his last regards. So he goes to hug her, pull the bodies off. She's still alive. She's in there with all these infected bodies. She's still alive. She didn't have the cholera. He helped drag her out. So here was a misdiagnosis and a premature burial that Bram got firsthand from his mom. And imagine him thinking the same thing in his own little stupor, either with the claret or not, thinking, what happens if they do this to me? How horrifying that could be. I am sure Freud would have a field day with that if they had to talk to this boy or his family, or Department of Social Services talk to Mrs. Stoker about this. So deep in his mind, as I go through this story, this is kind of the stuff. It's great for horror writers, but it's not great for regular people. When you look at, all the horror writers, we've had some pretty weird stuff go on, and stuff like this kind of helps, although we feel sad for the people who have to go through it. So here we've got this sort of thing in Bram's mind, and then he starts writing his story, and he does an incredible amount of research. He realizes that if he places this story in real time, which Dracula was, it was published in 1893, but it was actually, 1897, but it was set in 1893. All the diaries, all the schedules of events, 1893. It was a real-time book. So he did it in epistolary style, which is letters, diaries, journals. J.D. and I did the same thing. Makes the story feel very realistic. He wrote newspaper articles. He included those in the novel. He wrote memos. Same thing in the novel. This was Bram. This was his magnum opus. This was his own self being poured out on these pages. He went to these places, Whitby, which you see pictures down here. He went on a holiday and loved it so much that he changed the location of where the story was going to be, which was Austria, which had its own vampire scares, where Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu set Carmilla, and he placed it in Whitby. And if you go back to the novel, chapters 6, 7, and 8, it's all Whitby. And to this day, people walk around this really cool town with the book here and retrace the steps of Lucy and Mina, and you go to the churchyard up on top of that hill, where Dracula had his blood exchange with Mina, and so on and so forth. It's all right there. We also found that he did his research in a place called Cruden Bay, Scotland, just up north of Aberdeen. 13 summers he spent there. He could really only write on his holidays. But this is an incredible town. I'll show you some photos of it later. But he also is a lot like Jonathan Harker. Bram did get called to the bar. Bram had this legal side to him. Jonathan Harker was this young lawyer. There's a lot of similarities between these guys. We have found that he did his research in the London Library. As a matter of fact, the next few slides are amazing, because the guy that is the fundraiser at the London Library, who loves Dracula, looked at Bram's research notes that luckily had been published. They live in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, and two friends of mine have actually published them. And Bram was a good student, obviously, in his Trinity College. So even in his research for his book, he listed the sources that he looked at. And this head, Philip Spedding, of the London Library, walked through and found every single book on the bookshelves in general circulation. But what's even cooler is that Bram defaced all the books. He wrote in the margins with pencils things that caught his eye. I'll show you in just a minute. And so, I was sort of embarrassed when he said, Dacre, your father, your great-granduncle did this. And he said, no problem, no, because now we can actually prove that this is ground zero for Dracula. They love that. The book on the far right, the yellow one, there was an author from Scotland, Emily Gerard, introduced to Bram by Mark Twain. Bram and Mark Twain were good friends, neighbors in Chelsea. They both had these sort of open-minded, sort of sense in life, and they both were interested in spiritualism. Of course, not everyone, a lot of folks at the turn of the century were interested in all kinds of weird things, and Bram was this open-minded guy. So was Mark Twain. But Emily Gerard, a Scottish lady who had moved to northern Transylvania when she married a Polish guy in the Austrian-Hungarian cavalry, that's a mouthful, she loved her superstitions from Scotland, and she wrote a book about Transylvanian ones called Land Beyond the Forest. This book was like the first glimpse to sort of the civilized world in London of what weird stuff was going on in this country that was sort of beyond civilization. In the world at the time, London, England thought that the world ended in Budapest. And after that was like, ooh, the deep, dark nothing. And then we go into the Black Sea and then sort of the Turks and all this other interesting stuff, who my author friend in the back has written about. So he got his stuff from these books. This picture, the black and white one, is a castle in Cruden Bay, Scotland, where Bram did his research, and we now know that that part of that castle is what he used for his Castle Dracula. Kind of irritated the Romanians when I told them that. I said, that's okay. He combined elements of different castles. So here is the headlines from the newspaper from the London Library. Dracula writer was a sucker for defacing books. Nice soundbite. We see that what this guy did is what I do, is you go to libraries, you look for what proof was he here. Well, Hall Caine, the famous writer, wrote the ticket to allow Bram to become a member. And I'm standing in a library. I'm so thankful everyone's a librarian here, because without libraries, we wouldn't have Dracula, and I wouldn't be here. And because libraries exist, obviously in those days he didn't have any tablets or phones. He had to go into libraries because folks would collect books from writers and adventurers who went around the world, came back and wrote about it. And you're going to see just in a moment here, those are the books, those colorful picture up the top, all 28 books that Bram listed in his resources were up there. And here's one of them. Let me read the title, The Other World, or Glimpses of the Supernatural Being Facts, Records, and Traditions, relating to dreams, omens, miraculous occurrences, apparitions, wraiths, warnings, and so on. Written by Reverend Frederick George Lee, not some crackpot. This was a priest, a very respected priest, who's writing about the other world and these different superstitions and supernatural stuff. Now, you see that little line on the far right side of page 83? That's what Bram drew a line there. That caught his attention. And just quickly read you, I believe that this little line on the far side of that page, halfway down, was what made Uncle Bram decide where to place the action in this novel, which is up in the mountains. The Borgo Pass is a real place, mountains of northern Transylvania, near Bukovina. The power, activity, and malice of Satan is apparent from numerous statements in Holy Scripture, and most Christian writers who have dealt with the subject of evil spirits have maintained that their power and influence are unquestionably greater in some locations than others. It is commonly held that in lonely deserts, lofty mountains where the feet of men seldom tread, as well as in the mines of the earth, and the vast forests where desolation reigns, the powers of the devil and his angels, being unchecked and uncurbed by the positive, energizing activity of Christianity, are vast. Bram was looking for a devil, and he found it in this book. Good versus evil is the theme, obviously, of this novel. Here's another book. Okay, this is all about primitive superstitions, called Superstitions in Force. You see the little check mark? Okay? Volcanoes have always been objects of superstitious fear. They were supposed to be produced by subterranean gods who reside in the interior of the earth. He needed to focus on a volcano. Now, the other pages are just other defacing he did. Not important right now for this lecture. But he needed to focus on a volcano for his home of the evil and the devil. One of the books he had this wonderful diagram of Vesuvius. It was sort of just a concept, an image, so Bram could get this idea of the portal to hell, to where the devil resided. But Bram mentioned in the novel, I've done a word check of Dracula, and you see all these references to whenever there's evil coming, there's sulfurous gases around. That's connected to the devil. Here's another one, Popular Superstitions, written by Herbert Mayo, the family that started the Mayo Clinic. Another, not a crackpot. But in those days, mesmerism, ESP, this was something that people, it was a fringe science, yes. But it was something that Uncle Bram used because it was out there as possibly something that had some credibility. When a vampire and its victim exchanged blood, Mina could understand and kind of mind read Dracula and vice versa. So that he cherry-picked little things like this, these beliefs, and kind of stuck them into place. Now here's where he found Vlad the Impaler. I don't have time to go into the sort of Transylvanian and Wallachian history, but there was a book in the London Library, and it was also in the Whitby Library, that was written by William Wilkinson called The Accounts of Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. And it mentions, look at the very top corner, you can see Bram was typing, thank God, his notes at this point, because his handwriting was terrible. But the piece at the top I extracted from a book, Dracula in the Wallachian language means devil. The Wallachians were at that time, as they are present, used to give this as a surname to any person who rendered himself conspicuous either by courage, cruel action, or cunning. He found his guy. He needed a real person, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad III, who did all kinds of horrifying things. Bram simply used his name, but he needed, again, somebody that we would all think, oh yeah. And to this day, the guys that do the movies, even Jim Hart in the 92 Coppola movie, he connected more closely that this was Vlad the Impaler as his Dracula character. J.D. and I needed, when we were writing our story, we needed to, again, identify who's our guy, who's the real person. Look at this page for a moment. This is what most writers do. We write a page of our characters, and then we sort of fill in who they are and what they do. Top corner of this page, he writes Count Dracula. Folks, he has found his guy. He was originally going to call. Now go halfway down the page, and you'll see where there's a sort of a cross, 3 names crossed out. You see the Count, and then a line, and then Count, and then something blacked out. That was originally going to be Wampir. His story was going to be set in Austria, as I mentioned earlier, and that's the Austrian name for a vampire, Wampir, and he replaces it with Dracula. Things would have been a lot different if it was been Wampir as opposed to Dracula. And he writes it 2 other times on the page. So this is the genesis, folks, of Uncle Bram bringing us the most famous monster really ever. So now we morph into my story with 13 minutes left to go. So we take all the stuff that I learned from Bram and throw it into a story that I believe is going to have, hopefully have some decent impact to at least Dracula fans as well as people in general. I call myself a literary forensic detective. And what you see here is the actual seminal documents that I've traveled around the world trying to find. The Dracula notes in the Rosenbach Museum, an original preface, the color story I told you about, the missing 101 pages in the Dracula typescript that Paul Allen owns, the Jane Stoddard interview, which I'll tell you about in a moment, and this grandsons who I have to ply with a little bit of whiskey to get some good stories out of them, because once they get going, they do have some good stuff. Here is the original preface to Dracula before it was edited out. And just imagine you're my co-author who I'm trying to convince. There's a good possibility Bram thinks this story is real. I am quite convinced, this is the original preface now to Dracula, I am quite convinced there's no doubt whatever that the events here described really took place, however unbelievable and incomprehensible they might appear at first sight, and I am further convinced that they must always remain to some extent incomprehensible. Although continuing research in psychology and natural sciences may in years to come give logical explanations of such strange happenings, which at present neither scientists nor the secret police can understand, I state again that this mysterious tragedy, which is here described, is completely true to all its external respects. But the events are incontrovertible, and so many people know of them that they cannot be denied. One of the longest run-on sentences in the English language, but we get the point. And then I've skipped a couple to get to the end of it. All the people who have willingly or unwillingly played a part in this remarkable story are known generally and well respected. Both Jonathan Harker and his wife, who is a woman of character, and Dr. Seward are my friends and have been so for many years. I have never doubted they were telling the truth. You don't find this preface in the original Dracula. I believe his editor said, this is too scary. This was coming at the same time War of the Worlds. It's the same time he wrote the book when the Jack the Ripper murders were going on. And if this preface had gone in the original story before editing, I think it would have scared the bejesus out of people. Luckily, his editor backed him off, but I found it. So what did I do? And I've spoken to some of my author friends. This is one of the coolest things about being here is the breakfast times. When we're sitting around chatting about, Dacre, what was that seminal moment? What was the hook that got you into this story? And my background being a teacher and a coach was the illness that Bram went through. How did he miraculously recover from this illness? 7 years an invalid and then became a champion athlete. And I've seen many things at the Olympic level between 80 and 88 with human growth hormones and steroids and all this other stuff. So I'm thinking, how did Bram recover? There's no human growth hormones and steroids, but maybe some vampire blood. And so if there was, how do I make that plausible? Could that have made him recover? And if so, my premise is that he wrote Dracula, as you just heard, that the story was real. So he had some reason to believe that they could be real, that helped him recover, knowingly or unknowingly. He was subjected to this. Ireland is very mystical, lots of stories, druids and all these other things, so maybe, just maybe, that's enough. These are some of the trophies that he won as an athlete once he had this good blood in him to make him recover. This is the family. This is the real family. Young Bram, just after he recovered, and I'm going to kind of speed up to get some things done, so I won't spend too long on these, but look at Ellen. This dark picture of Ellen, that's the actual nanny that stayed with the family. She's a major character in our story. And for some reason, her picture doesn't come up very well. Matilda, Bram's eldest sister, not doctored, that wasn't doctored at all. Bram's eldest sister, who was a major character in the story, was also an artist. This piece of art my wife actually found on the internet, this thing up top, which is this sort of Celtic design of snakes. Look at that. The hardcover edition, they took this, my publisher took it and made that the spine of the book. I thought that was so cool to have a real character who's an artist, have her work on the outside of the book. The image below is her and actually a plate my wife found on eBay. And the writing, it's hard to see, designed and painted by Matilda Stoker, 1870. So as an author, I jump at this going, the thing was from a Paris antique store. She probably was there in 1870. That's enough to use that in a story. Just little things like that we jump on and use. Dr. William Thornley Stoker was knighted. He was a very famous doctor, but remember I mentioned he's the guy who was a medical consultant for Bram in the novel. He's the guy that actually drew this diagram so Bram figured out how to do brain trepitation for Seward and Van Helsing on Renfield when he had the brain hemorrhage. He also had a wife that went insane. He did brain surgery on people who were insane, helping to make them better. Nowadays, or not nowadays, later on they started zapping them with electricity. Obviously, they've advanced a lot, but he's a major character in the story because of things that I found that were real stuff about him. So is this guy, Arminius Van Burine. Many scholars go, no, there's no proof, Dacre, that Van Burine told Bram about anything. I found the proof, okay? This is a table seating arrangement, and I'm going to really speed up here, but if you can see over on the right, your right-hand side, Tom Stoker. Underneath Tom is Van Burine. Next to Ellen Terry, Mrs. McMichael, Loveday, Edie Terry. Ellen Terry, the famous actress, has 2 kids. B.S. is Bram Stoker next to Mrs. McMichael. H.I. is Henry Irving, Bram's boss. Mrs. Stoker, Grusha, is the secretary of the Prime Minister of Hungary, who's traveling with Van Burine. And then Edie Terry. They were at dinner. I found 2 of these cards together. So I'm convinced that this Van Burine guy was a source of information. Why is that? Look at this page pulled out of Dracula. Just because of speed, look at only the things underlined. I have asked my friend Arminius of Budapest University, where the real guy was a professor, to make his record. And from all that means they are, he tell me who he has been. He must have been this Vivoid Dracula. They're talking about who this vampire was. The Vivoid Dracula, the Prince Dracula, who won his name against the Turks. And you go down here and you see things like Land Beyond the Forest, other references. The Draculas, says Arminius, are a great and noble race. And though now and again we're scions, of who held their coevals to have had dealings with the evil one. Once again, the devil. Bram and Florence and young Noel went to Whitby, 1890, just 2 months after that dinner with Van Burine. I'm sure Van Burine said, hey, you want something interesting to look at? You got to look up this guy, Dracula. He went in the museum in Whitby and found this Wilkinson book which said Dracula was the devil. Bingo, the piece of the puzzle come together. These are some of the really neat sites where the story took place. Our story as well as Bram's, because I've been there now many times trying to get this thing absolutely just right. Bram goes to Whitby and look at his terrible handwriting, but he sits up on the cliffs, and this is what Whitby looked like in his time. And he's got his handwriting as he sits on a bench and writes on his knee. Because the top left hand is blank. That's what happens when we write on our knee without a hard surface. This is the Whitby Abbey, and J.D. and I needed to prove that this tower existed. The cool thing is, well, not so cool, sadly, in World War II, the Germans bombed it because the Brits had put up a listening device, obviously for radar and communication, and the Germans thought that's not a good thing for us. So they sent a ship along to bomb it. So it existed when our story took place, but it doesn't now. And for writers of historical fiction, we get called on these things all the time. And if we get it wrong, boy, readers love to roast you on it, but I like to get stuff right. So if you do buy my book, and please buy the book, this is where all the now parts take place, in this tower. Just a little hint, not a spoiler, just a little hint. It really existed. It was really there. And drone photography is really helpful nowadays. Now, without a pointer, I got to have you guys look really close here. You look at Whitby Abbey without the tower. This is a graveyard. But it's not in the regular graveyard. It's this unconsecrated grave. And in the vampire world, we realize, because of Emily Gerard and others, that if somebody commits suicide, they don't get to be buried with all the other guys. That's a sin. So this is the unconsecrated graveyard. It exists. No more spoilers. It's there. The bay, this cove, is where the Demeter ship actually came in real. And it came in the story. Remember I said there was a Jane Stoddard interview? I'm going to give you a little piece of it. Bram, for whatever reason, was only asked by one person to give an interview about his story. J.D. and I used some of this information. And Jane Stoddard asked Bram, tell me about your story. Where'd this whole idea come from? Where'd the myth of the vampire come from? He says, it is undoubtedly a very fascinating theme since it touches both on mystery and fact. In the Middle Ages, the terror of the vampire depopulated whole villages. Where'd you get all this from? And he goes, certain parts of Styria survived the longest, but the legend is common in many countries: China, Iceland, Germany, Saxony, Turkey, Chersonese, Russia, Poland, Italy, France, England, besides the Tartar communities. Folks, many people in these countries believe that vampires were real. Bram simply capitalized on that. Here's one of my favorite passages from the novel proving that. There are such beings as vampires. This is Van Helsing, okay? Explaining to the medical guy Seward and everyone else. There are such beings as vampires. Some of us have evidence that they exist. Even had we not the proof of our own unhappy experience, the teachings and the records of the past give proof enough for sane peoples. I admit that at first I was skeptic, were it not that the long years I have trained myself to keep an open mind, I could not have believed until such time as the fact thunder on my ear. This is Bram. This is his own belief system, I believe, from what I've just told you all about him and what he's learned and what he's studied. This is him inserting himself into the novel. And here's where it sort of came from. I will just touch a little bit with 2 minutes left. Anybody heard of the bricks in the mouth of these skulls? Because this is what one of the things that people did when they suspected vampire victims, and really was happening was the plague was running through different countries. And in this particular case, you see the Italian down below, Mascatoni moratorium, the chewing dead. There was a plague that went through Italy, shallow graves, not a lot of dirt, 400 bodies in the graves. And when their bodies decomposed all at about the same time, because they all died the same time, they're lying in the grave, and their jaws would come down because these tendons were the toughest, sinuous muscles, and they would decompose, and then there'd be a crunching sound on the top. And the folks living on top were already scared to death of what was causing all these diseases and mysterious deaths. They would go and exhume the bodies and see these bloated bodies, which from the gases, from decomposition, and redness around the shrouds, which was the juices leaking out of the mouth, thinking that these guys were trying to chew their way out. How do we keep them in there? We stick a brick in their mouth. That'll stop them from getting out. This is what Philip Rohr wrote in 1733. And there was plenty more. Look at all the others I found. They all coincided with contagious diseases around the world. What Bram did is he took all these ideas, and here's 2 pages of notes, and one of them actually I put in the back of my novel. And you can see he took all these traits from these different treatises and put them in here and made his famous vampire. He also found a newspaper article in the US where he connected Charles Darwin, who was actually writing about the real vampire bats, and tuberculosis in our country. It wasn't the plague, but it was exactly the same misconception. People believed this was really happening. Bram jumped on that. J.D. and I did the same. Here's Bran Castle, a couple different images. I'm going to try to just fire through because I want to show you one final picture here. This is the castle in Scotland that I told you about. This is some drone footage of that castle. And it's actually mentioned in chapter 1 about this octagonal room. The Count halted, putting down my bags, closed the door, crossing the room, opened another door which led into a small octagonal room. Bram took part of Slains and stuck it up on top of this mountain, and this mountain is over here. Nope, that's the changed ending. There it is. All right, this is my last slide, I promise. I know we got to hurry. Here's a map that I found in the London Library, in one of the books. In the Rosenbach Library in Philadelphia, there's this map coordinates, 47 longitude, 25 3/4 latitude. When you go there, you actually see that this is a volcano in northern Transylvania next to Bukovina. And this is the changed ending I promised I'd bring you. Look at this image. Had Bram not edited this out, there would have been a massive volcanic eruption right after Quincy Morris and Jonathan Harker stabbed the Count and slit his throat. And you can see the stuff cut out. That was the original ending for Dracula. And Bram was so precise, and he had such that analytical mind that if he was going to have his story end with a volcanic eruption, by God, it's really going to be on a volcano. That's me pointing at the volcano, because I was there last summer, and I actually put up a plaque commemorating this, which I'm very proud of, that I'm continuing the family legacy. And we're not even going to do one more thing. I would say that the film rights have been sold to Paramount, and I'm hopefully that they'll make a film to bring it to a larger audience. Thank you, folks, very much.